And welcome to another session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. And in this session, Gabriel Bodard of the University of London is going to show you how to use an XML editor, and specifically how to use the Oxygen XML Editor to work with XML files. So please, Gabby, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Irene. For this demonstration, as Irene says, we're going to use the XML editor Oxygen, and there are all sorts of other editors that you could use, but this one has some useful features which we'll be illustrating here. Most of the process of encoding and tagging in XML will be pretty much the same in any editor, but for those of you who are using the Oxygen XML editor, this will give you a useful way to start. In preparation for this demonstration, I have created on my desktop a folder which I've called EpiDoc and the year, and I've put in this folder a copy of the EpiDoc schema, which you see here, ti-epidoc.rng. If you make a copy of this, you may find that the .rng is invisible because some operating systems like to hide those things. You can find a copy of that schema at the URL given on your screen now. And I've also put in here a copy of the EpiDoc template, which is full name there, which is the XML file. And this file you can also find online at the URL given here. I've put those into a folder so that I can use them together, and so that I can work in one place and not have files scattered all over the place. I've also got a quick reference document in there, just so that I can look things up quickly, but this is just keeping things all in one place. The first thing I'm going to do before I create my first XML file and show you how to open this in Oxygen is I'm going to take the template document, which I just mentioned, and I'm going to make a copy of it. And I can make a copy of that in various ways. But the simplest way is to simply drag it while holding down the Alt key on my Mac, which I do thus, and I'm gonna call this my first XML file. Call it by something useful, something that will be memorable and be relevant to your edition. You can then open this in Oxygen either by right-clicking on it and say open with and scroll down until you find Oxygen. On my machine the default is Oxygen, but on your machine it probably won't be, so it may either be in this longer list, or you may even have to go to other to track it down. Or the quickest way is, if you've got Oxygen open in the background as I do, simply to drag it into there and it opens it in Oxygen. You then simply move to Oxygen and you've got your file open in the middle of the screen. So a couple more things before we start. Things that I like to do is you see you've got these bars down the left and the right hand side of the screen with useful pieces of functionality in them. Those are actually not very useful for us, so I would suggest simply closing those and getting rid of them. So you have your full screen is made up of your XML file, and you'll see why this is useful as you start to see how an XML file really bloats in size and the lines get quite long. So a couple of things you might want to do with your XML file as you go before you start might include changing the display options, and I'm going to do this going to the options menu and selecting preferences. And two things I'm going to do, take a few seconds to appear. I'm going to go to fonts, and you can see under fonts the editor font, because we're using this in editor mode. And the editor font for me is set at Arial Unicode MS size 20. This is something I've set it at because it's a font with good Unicode coverage, and I like it to be quite nice and large. But you can simply, by selecting choose, you can choose your favorite font, especially if you write in a language other than Latin, a script other than Latin. You may want a font that handles your script well. And I like to have quite a nice font size. I would, you'll maybe set to font size 10 or 12 or something, which I find just tiny on the screen. So I'd set that to a bit larger. I'm going to set it, in fact, to even larger, to 24, not because I would normally work in that size, but just so that so that it's more visible on the screen for this display. The other thing that you might like to do, and I'll need to try and remember where this is on the thing, is the line wrap. Sorry, I may have lost that already. Irene, can you remember where line wrap was?
Well, you can type a line wrap in the...
Oh, that's right, you can filter
so it's an easier way.
And
also wrap.
So let me just look for wrap. Something under text. No. Format. Maybe just under text. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So going back to the start, it's under Editor, Edit Modes, Text, and there's this option here, Line Wrap. And by default, that's normally turned on. I have that turned. That's not normally turned off. I have that turned on. And what that means is that if your line of text ends up being longer than the width of the screen, it will wrap onto the next line, as you'd expect it to do in a word processor, for example. Otherwise, and what it does is it goes off the screen. And in order to see the end of the line, you have to scroll the screen across to get to it. Some people prefer having line wrap switched off, but I prefer having that switched on. So I'm just going to select that. And you can see here now my lines are wrapping across the screen here. This is a single line of text, but it's wrapped across 2 lines on the screen because it's too long to fit on the screen. The second thing I'm going to do just quickly, I put the EpiDoc schema in the folder, as you recall, here, and by default, this template that we're using, it points to the online version of the EpiDoc schema so that it can validate your file for you as you go along, and we'll look at how that works in a moment. But that involves going to this website every time you need to validate it, which is actually every time you type a keystroke, it tries to validate your file and just checks that you haven't broken it. In that keystroke, and that can actually really slow things down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the URL from there and just leave the file name of the schema, because I've put the schema in the same folder as the XML file. So just the file name is enough for it to find the schema, and you have to do it twice because it's using the schema in 2 different ways, which you don't need to worry about. But you do need to make sure that both references to the URL, to the schema, are file name only. Okay, so having done that, notice that whenever I type a keystroke using the command button or any other button, the keystroke I type appears in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So there I just saved my file after making those changes, and you see the command S appearing in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. That may be useful if I do something with a keystroke shortcut and I forget to tell you what it is I've done. So the first thing that schema reference there does for you is it validates your file. If there are any errors in your file now, in the part of the file that's visible on the screen, they will quickly be made visible by the XML editor. So for example, we know that the root of every TEI document, of which includes all EpiDoc documents, the root element of that has to be this element TEI. If we try to put some other element in there as a root, such as, for example, we tried to put in an element called techie, that would not be a TEI element, it would not be an EpiDoc element, and you see it's already underlined that in red because it's saying this is not an element that we expect to see. Element techie not allowed anywhere, expected either TEI or TEI corpus. Okay, yeah, TEI corpus is another possibility. So that's having the schema has done that, has enabled that for us. So we can immediately see if we make a mistake by typing. You can also ask your file to validate using this this button here, which looks like a document with a red check mark on it, and you can say validate, or you can ask it to validate to another schema other than the one that you're using by default if you want to. But that will then give you a report, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, it'll say here now in green, document is valid. Whereas if I had called my document techie and I said validate it, it would give me an error report of all the errors it finds in this document, which for some reason it's reporting the element techie as being wrong 4 times, because I guess because it's such a big error. It's important enough to keep telling you Gabby, it's wrong. Gabby, it's wrong. Gabby, it's wrong. So I'm fixing it. Don't worry, Schema. And saving the document, because as we all know, we should save the document regularly. There are, as you may recall, two different kinds of validation, or two different kinds of errors that might occur in your document. The first is invalid issues with the document. So as with that case, the XML file was still well formed. It still had one root element containing everything else. It's just that root element was not recognized by the schema. If instead we have a different kind of error, where we have this element title, opening tag title, has a closing tag title instead, and this is therefore ill-formed because it's not well-formed XML anymore, and we get the same error thing immediately, but it's now saying the element type title must be terminated by the matching end tag title, and that's a well-formedness error. That's it doesn't even need the schema to be able to find that sort of error for us. So that's very, very easy for us to fix that on the spot. So these are all the things that the schema enables us to do. The other thing the schema does for us is that when I'm inside this title element, not every single element in the TEI schema is available to me in here, is legal in this location. So for example, I couldn't put a TEI element inside the title element in here, right? It would make no sense. So when I try to enter a new element inside here, it will only offer me a menu of those elements that are available. And so I can start doing that. I can simply type an opening angle bracket, and immediately it gives me this menu of all the elements that are available at this point. And there's quite a lot of them, but not the nearly 600 elements that the TEI schema has as a whole. It's a much shorter list than that. So I can select them off this list, or I can keep typing. I know that the element I'm going to enter here begins with a P and then an E, and then there's only one element that's available at that thing, so I can just press enter and get that element in there. And so I can then say, you know, whatever it is I wanted to say about this, you know, something like that, where I put a name tag in the document. So that's one of the ways in which you can enter an element, a tag name in Oxygen. Notice that when I typed that person name tag, it entered not only the opening tag but also the closing tag for that element, because every element that opens has to close, right? We know that already. So it put both parts of that in for me. That's very convenient. It saves a lot of time. I don't need to type both the opening tag and the closing tag. But if I already had the text already said Alexander Monument, and I wanted to put person name around Alexander, and I did it by typing as there, so I type angle bracket. You notice that when I type angle bracket this time, person name is at the top of the list because it says that's the last thing you did. Maybe you want to do it again. But I can do the whole thing by typing instead of by selecting, but then person name appears immediately after, and I need to then move that closing person name tag and drag it across to where the end of the name Alexander is. Okay, that's not hugely onerous, but it's still a bit of a pain, and especially if you've got long text and complex elements, that can be a bit messy. So the second way of entering an element in Oxygen is to select the text that you want to tag. In this case, I just double clicked on the name Alexander. If it's not a whole word, you can just drag your cursor across it to select. And then if you press Command and E, as you see in the bottom left corner of the screen there, you get that same menu popping up of all the elements that are available at this point in the document. And I could say, I'm going to tag the word Alexandra as some element from that list. Okay. The one thing you might have noticed as I've been moving my mouse randomly around this screen is we occasionally get these pop-ups, which I've quickly moved away from because they're obscuring what I'm trying to talk about. But this is another thing that having a schema associated with this document helps us with. If you hover your cursor over any element, that is either over the opening tag or the closing tag of that element, it will, by having the schema open in the background, and the schema includes the definitions of the elements as well as just which ones are available, it'll give you a brief description of that element. So I'm hovering over the closing title tag here, and it says that this element that you're hovering over contains a title for any kind of work. And here is where you can go in the TI guidelines to find more information about that. And you could, if you could move your mouse more quick enough, you could even click on that blue TI guidelines, I think, to go there. But I can't seem to be able to do that. Maybe you can't do that. Maybe I imagine that. So that's how to enter an element in your XML editor, in the Oxygen XML editor. One other small trick actually for entering elements. Say I want to tag several pieces of heraldry in the same document. I could do the same thing each time. I could say, and heraldry, okay, it's only 2 or 3 keystrokes. But there is also a shortcut to repeat the same element that you last did several times, and that is to press Command, and on the English keyboard, it's Command and /, and that simply enters the last element you entered. I know on some non-QWERTY keyboards, some European keyboards, it's a different character. The / is the character immediately to the left of the right shift button on this keyboard. So it may be that there's another button in that area which does the same thing. But if you're using an English keyboard, you can simply use Command / and it'll enter the same element that you just entered a moment ago. Okay, the last thing I want to illustrate, I think, in here, the last couple of things, is the entering of attributes. Remember that when you learned about XML syntax, an attribute is something whose name appears immediately after the element name in the opening tag, separated by a space. So if I type a space after the tag name heraldry, the XML editor knows that after that space, after that name with a space, I want to be entering an attribute. So it immediately says, here are all the attributes you could enter on this element. And I can scroll down and I can select it from this list. Or I can ignore this pop-up and I can just say, well, I know what element or attribute it is. I'm just going to type it myself. Okay, and I could just type the element and I could say, I'm saying something about the certainty of that thing. But if you enter it from that list, you get one further advantage. So I select it from the list. If it's a controlled vocabulary, I can also get a menu of the items on that list, and I don't need to type the value. I can select it and it enters it for me. Okay, so the schema knows what elements are available at every given point in your text. It knows what attributes are available on each element, and some attributes may be available in some contexts and not others. That's probably not the case in EpiDoc, but it certainly would be in some schemas. And it knows if that attribute has a controlled vocabulary, what are the values in that controlled vocabulary that you can choose from. And having done all this, you can then also you would validate your text and see what it says. So I hit validate, and my document is valid. So I'm going to save it and call this a win. That's about all I can think of. Is there anything else you think we should illustrate, Irene?
No, it was perfect. So thank you, Gabby.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.